My name is Omar. I'm 27 years old, and until recently, I was living two completely different lives. I need to tell you this story because keeping it inside is killing me. Some of you watching this will think I'm a traitor. Others will think I'm confused. Maybe both are true. But what I know for certain is that I can't pretend anymore. Let me start at the beginning.
Hello, viewers from around the world. Before our brother Omar continues his story, we'd love to know where you are watching from, and we would love to pray for you and your city. Thank you, and may God bless you as you listen to this powerful testimony.
I was born in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, into a family that took Islam very seriously. My father worked as an accountant for a major oil company, but in our community he was known as someone who really knew the Quran. People would come to our house to ask him questions about religion, about how to handle business dealings the Islamic way, about marriage issues. My mother wore full niqab when she left the house. She prayed 5 times a day, every single day, and I never once saw her miss a prayer time. We weren't extremists. I need you to understand that. My parents weren't harsh or cruel. They loved us. My father would bring us sweets on Fridays after Jummah prayer. My mother made the best kapsa I've ever tasted, and our house always smelled like cardamom and rose water. We had family gatherings where everyone laughed and told stories. My childhood wasn't miserable, but it was strict. I learned to pray when I was 7. My father would wake me before dawn for Fajr, even when I was so tired I could barely stand. I learned the movements, the Arabic words, the ritual washing. By the time I was 9, I had memorized several chapters of the Quran. My father would test me after dinner, making me recite while he followed along in his copy, correcting my pronunciation. I have 2 younger sisters and a younger brother. I'm the oldest. That meant something in my family. It meant I had to set the example. When I turned 13, my father started taking me to the mosque for all 5 daily prayers, not just for Yuma. Other boys from school were there too, and afterward we'd talk and laugh. But during the prayers, we had to be serious. The Imam would watch us. Here's what I never told anyone back then. Even as a child, I had questions. I remember being maybe 10 years old, lying in bed at night, wondering why God only spoke Arabic. I wondered why women had to cover everything while men didn't. I wondered why my mother, who was smarter than most people I knew, had to ask my father's permission for simple things. But I learned quickly that these weren't questions you asked out loud. Once, when I was 12, I asked my father why we had to pray 5 times every single day. He looked at me like I'd slapped him. He didn't yell, but his voice got very quiet and serious. He told me that Allah commanded it, and that was enough. He said questioning Allah's commands was the first step toward shaitan, towards Satan. I never asked again. Instead, I learned to push the questions down. I learned to do what was expected. I memorized more Quran. I fasted during Ramadan. I lowered my gaze around women who weren't family. I became the son my parents wanted me to be, on the outside at least. When I was 18, my father made a decision that changed everything. He wanted me to study engineering at university, and he'd saved enough money to send me to London. King's College London had accepted me for civil engineering. My parents were so proud. They threw a big dinner party before I left. inviting all our relatives and my father's friends. Everyone kept telling me how lucky I was, how I'd bring honor to the family, how I'd come back and help build Saudi Arabia's future. My mother cried when she hugged me goodbye at the airport. She made me promise to pray 5 times a day, to find a good mosque, to stay away from alcohol and girls and anything haram. I promised. I meant it when I said it. London hit me like a wave. I'd seen Western movies, of course. We had satellite TV at home, though my parents monitored what we watched. But being there, living there, was completely different. The noise, the crowds, the way people dressed, the way they talked to each other without any formality. Women in short skirts walking past without anyone caring. Couples holding hands, kissing in public. Alcohol everywhere. The university assigned me to a dormitory in Southwark. My roommate was a guy named James from Manchester. First day, he offered me a beer. I said no, told him I was Muslim, that I didn't drink. He just shrugged and said no problem. But I could tell he thought it was weird. I found a mosque near campus, Masjid al-Tawheed in Whitechapel. I went for Jummah prayers every Friday. The community there was mostly Bangladeshi and Pakistani, with some Arabs and African Muslims. Everyone was friendly enough, but I felt out of place. The sermons were half in English, half in Arabic or Urdu. The Imam talked a lot about staying strong in the faith, about the dangers of Western society, about remembering who we were. But Monday through Thursday, I was living in a completely different world. In my engineering classes, I was the only visibly Muslim student. I'd leave class to pray Dhuhr in an empty study room, rolling out a small prayer mat I kept in my backpack. Some students would see me and look curious. Others would look uncomfortable. Nobody said anything directly, but I felt like an outsider. I made friends slowly. There was Ahmed, an Egyptian guy studying medicine who was also Muslim. We'd get halal food together in Edgware Road and talk about how strange London was. There was Aisha, a British Pakistani girl in hijab, who was in my statistics class. She seemed to have figured out how to be Muslim and British at the same time, but I never understood how she did it. Then there were my non-Muslim friends. James from my dorm, who turned out to be a good guy despite our differences. Sophie, a girl from my engineering cohort who helped me with my English when I first arrived. Marcus, a Nigerian student who was always laughing about something. They'd invite me to pubs, to parties, to dinners, where I'd have to carefully check if the food was halal. I started going sometimes, just to the dinners, not the pubs. Just to be social, I told myself, just to not be the weird foreign guy who never left his room. But it got harder to maintain the lines I'd drawn. I remember the first time I missed Asr prayer. It was my second year, and I was in the library working on a project due the next morning. I'd been there for hours, my eyes burning from staring at the computer screen. I checked my phone and realized it was already Maghrib time. I'd missed the afternoon prayer completely. I felt sick. I went to the bathroom and tried to pray Asr late. But the whole time I was reciting the words, I felt like a hypocrite. I'd been so absorbed in my work that I'd forgotten Allah completely. That's what it felt like I'd forgotten. It happened again a few weeks later. Then again. Soon I was only really praying Fajr and Isha when I was home alone in my dorm and Juma at the mosque. The other prayers just slipped away. I told myself it was temporary. I was busy, stressed with school. I'd get back to proper prayers when things calmed down. But things never calmed down. My father would video call every week. He'd ask about my studies, about whether I was praying, about whether I'd found a good Muslim community. I'd lie. I'd tell him everything was fine, that I was praying regularly, that I had good Muslim friends who kept me accountable. He'd smile, satisfied, and tell me how proud he was. Those calls made me feel like I was being split in half. Then, in my third year, I met a girl named Emily. Jokes that weren't even that funny. We started meeting at coffee shops to work on the project. Then we started meeting even when we didn't have work to do. I knew it was wrong. According to everything I'd been taught, I shouldn't even be alone with a woman who wasn't my relative. But I told myself we were just friends, just study partners. I ignored the feeling in my chest when she smiled at me. It became more than friendship. I don't need to give you details, but over several months, we became close, very close. She didn't know much about Islam, but she'd ask questions sometimes. She'd ask why I didn't drink, why I'd sometimes excuse myself to pray. I gave her simple answers, but honestly, I was barely praying anymore by then. My parents started talking about arranging a marriage for me after graduation. They'd video call and mention daughters of family friends back in Riyadh, good Muslim girls from good families. My mother would get excited describing them. I'd make non-committal noises and change the subject. The guilt was eating me alive. I'd go to the mosque on Fridays and sit there during the sermon, listening to the imam talk about avoiding sin, about lowering your gaze, about staying away from zina. I'd feel physically sick. After prayer, I'd make dua, begging Allah to forgive me, promising I'd do better. Then I'd meet Emily that evening and do the exact same things I'd just asked forgiveness for. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I was just another young Muslim who went to the West and lost his faith, who got distracted by girls and parties and forgot who he was. Maybe that's true, but it felt more complicated than that. The truth is, even when I was sinning, I was terrified of hellfire. I'd lie awake at night thinking about Judgment Day, about standing before Allah and having to account for every secret sin. I'd think about the descriptions of Jahannam I'd memorized as a child, the fire that burns skin and then renews it so it can burn again forever. I was absolutely terrified. But I was also exhausted. I was exhausted from trying to be two different people. I was exhausted from the guilt that never went away no matter how many times I prayed for forgiveness. I was exhausted from pretending to my parents that I was the good Muslim son they thought they'd raised. The relationship with Emily ended during my final year. She wanted something serious, something with a future, and I couldn't give her that. I couldn't imagine bringing a British non-Muslim girl home to Riyadh. I couldn't imagine the shame it would bring my family. So I ended it badly, without explaining why, and she was hurt and angry. I don't blame her. After we broke up, I tried to get serious about Islam again. I really did. I started praying all 5 times a day. I'd set alarms on my phone. I went to the mosque more often, not just for Juma but for other prayers too. I started reading Quran again, something I'd barely done in years, but it felt mechanical. I was going through the motions. The Arabic words came out of my mouth, but they felt empty. I wasn't connecting to anything. It was like making a phone call and getting no answer, just ringing and ringing into silence. I graduated with decent marks. My parents flew to London for the ceremony, and it was the first time they'd visited me in 4 years. My mother cried happy tears. My father embraced me and told me he was proud. We took photos in front of the university. I wore my cap and gown, and they stood on either side of me, beaming. I felt like the biggest fraud in the world. After graduation, I got a job with an engineering consultancy in London. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well. My father wanted me to come home to Saudi Arabia, but I convinced him I needed a few years of international experience first. The truth was, I couldn't imagine going back. In London, at least I had some freedom, even if I didn't know what to do with it. I moved into a small flat in Canary Wharf, a one-bedroom place that cost way too much. I decorated it simply, almost like I was afraid to make it feel like home. I had a prayer mat rolled up in the corner. I used it sometimes, but not consistently. My 20s became a blur of work, occasional nights out with colleagues, and long stretches of loneliness. I'd go to the mosque sometimes, but less and less frequently. I'd sit in my flat on Friday evenings and think about how I should be at Juma prayer, but I'd stay home instead. The guilt was still there, but it had become background noise, something I'd learned to live with. I went through the motions of finding halal restaurants when I ate out. I didn't drink alcohol, though by this point it was more habit than conviction. I'd sometimes download dating apps and then delete them immediately, disgusted with myself. I was too Muslim for the Western girls I met, and not Muslim enough for the Muslim girls who were actually practicing their faith. I was stuck in the middle of nowhere. When I was 26, I started having panic attacks. The first one happened at work during a meeting. My heart started racing. I couldn't breathe properly, and I had to excuse myself and hide in the bathroom. I thought I was having a heart attack. I went to the doctor, and after some tests, they told me it was anxiety. They offered me medication. I took it for a while. The attacks kept happening. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. with my heart pounding, feeling like something terrible was about to happen. I'd lie there in the dark, in my expensive flat, successful by most measures, and feel absolutely empty. I started thinking about death a lot. Not suicidal thoughts, but just awareness of mortality. I'd be on the tube going to work and suddenly think about how all these people around me were going to die someday. I'd think about my own death, about facing Allah, about what would happen to me. That's when I decided to do Hajj. I was lying in bed after another panic attack, the sun just starting to come up, and the thought came to me clearly. You need to go to Mecca. You need to do Hajj. Maybe that will fix whatever's broken inside you. In Islam, Hajj is one of the 5 pillars. Every Muslim who's physically and financially able is supposed to make the pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their lifetime. It's this huge, intense religious experience. Millions of Muslims from around the world all converging on Saudi Arabia, all performing the same rituals that go back to the Prophet Ibrahim, to the Prophet Muhammad, to the beginning of Islam itself. I called my father that morning and told him I wanted to do Hajj. He was quiet for a moment, and then I heard the emotion in his voice. He said he was so happy that this was what he'd been praying for, that this would change my life. He said he'd help me arrange everything. My mother got on the phone and started crying happy tears. She said she knew I'd come back to the straight path, that Allah had been watching over me, that this was the answer to her prayers. My siblings all sent congratulatory messages. The family group chat lit up with celebration. I felt like I was drowning. But I went through with it. I put in for time off work. I started the paperwork. I watched videos about how to perform Hajj properly, all the steps and rituals I needed to know. I bought the ihram, the simple white cloths pilgrims wear. I read about the spiritual significance, about how this was supposed to strip away all worldly distinctions, about how everyone from kings to beggars wore the same thing and performed the same rituals. I told myself this would work. I told myself that once I was there, in the holiest place in Islam, standing before the Kaaba, something would finally click. The emptiness would be filled. The questions would be answered. I'd finally feel the connection I was supposed to feel. I had no idea what was actually coming. The months before Hajj were strange. I found myself praying more, but it felt desperate rather than devoted. I'd pray and think, please, please let this work. Please let me feel something. Please fix me. I didn't even know who I was talking to anymore. Allah felt distant, like a concept rather than a presence. I told my co-workers I was taking a couple weeks off for a family obligation. Only one colleague, a Muslim guy named Tariq, knew I was doing Hajj. He congratulated me and told me to make dua for him when I was there. I said I would. I flew from Heathrow to Jeddah in late July. The plane was full of pilgrims, some in ihram already, some still in regular clothes. There were old men with long beards, families with young children, women in hijab speaking a dozen different languages. The atmosphere was excited, anticipatory. People were talking about how blessed we all were, how this was the journey of a lifetime. I looked out the window at the clouds and felt numb. In Jeddah, we went through processing. Thousands of pilgrims funneling through, getting our paperwork checked, our biometrics scanned. Then buses to Mecca, packed tight, was the air conditioning barely working in the Saudi heat. The landscape outside was brown and rocky, harsh and beautiful at the same time. Then we arrived in Mecca, and I saw it for the first time. The Masjid al-Haram, the Grand Mosque, rising up like something from another world. The minarets reaching into the sky. And in the center, the Kaaba, the black cube, the most sacred site in Islam, the place Muslims around the world face when they pray. We made our way through the crowds. There were so many people from every corner of the earth. Black, white, brown, Asian, Arab, African, European. All of us in simple white cloths, all equal before God. Or at least that's what we were supposed to be. I entered the mosque with thousands of others. The marble floors were cool under my bare feet. The air smelled like incense and sweat and perfume. I rounded a corner and there it was, the Kaaba. It sat in the center of the huge open courtyard, and around it, like a whirlpool, thousands of people were circling it counterclockwise. This is Tawaf, the first ritual. 7 circuits around the Kaaba, praising Allah with each step. I joined the crowd and began to circle. Bodies pressed against me from all sides. The heat was overwhelming. People were crying, calling out to Allah, their hands raised in supplication. I saw old men weeping, women sobbing, young boys with expressions of awe. I felt nothing. I tried. I really tried. I raised my hands like everyone else. I recited the prayers I'd memorized. I looked at the Kaaba, this sacred place, and tried to feel something, anything. But there was just emptiness. 7 circuits took over an hour in the crushing crowd. When I finished, I was exhausted and disappointed. But there was more to do. The rituals of Hajj are specific and demanding. You go to different locations, you perform different acts, all with precise spiritual meanings I'd studied before coming. We went to Safa and Marwa, now 2 small hills inside the mosque complex, and walked between them 7 times, commemorating Hajar's search for water for her son Ismail. Back and forth, in the heat, in the crowds. Then we traveled to Mina, a tent city where millions of pilgrims stay. We slept on the ground in huge tents, thousands of us packed together. The bathrooms were horrible. Everyone was tired and sweaty and uncomfortable. But this was part of it, part of the test, part of surrendering your comfort for Allah. The next day we went to Arafat, a plain surrounded by hills. This is the climax of Hajj. You stand in the heat from noon until sunset, praying and making dua, asking Allah for forgiveness for all your sins. This is where pilgrims are supposed to feel closest to God, where prayers are most likely to be answered. I stood there for hours under the burning sun. Around me, people were crying, begging, pouring out their hearts. I tried to do the same. I prayed for forgiveness for everything I'd done wrong, for Emily, for lying to my parents, for missing prayers, for all of it. But it felt like my prayers were hitting a wall and falling back down. The sun set. We moved on to Muzdalifah, slept under the stars on rocky ground, collected pebbles for the next ritual. In the morning, exhausted and sore, we went back to Mina and threw stones at 3 pillars representing Satan. Everyone was shouting as they threw, rejecting evil, rejecting temptation. I threw my stones mechanically. I felt like I was performing in a play where I'd forgotten my lines. This went on for days. More rituals, more prayers, more crowds. I was doing everything I was supposed to do, following every step, but inside I was screaming with frustration. Why wasn't this working? Why wasn't I feeling anything? What was wrong with me? On the 4th night of Hajj, I couldn't sleep. We were back near the Haram, and I left our group and walked toward the mosque. It was late, maybe 2 a.m., but the mosque never really empties. There are always people there, praying, circumambulating the Kaaba. I found a spot on the marble floor where I could sit and see the Kaaba. The black cloth covering it, the gold Arabic calligraphy, the pilgrims circling endlessly. The lights of the mosque were bright, but the sky above was dark. I sat there, completely exhausted, and finally let myself think the thought I'd been pushing away for years. What if none of this is true? What if I'm performing all these rituals and it means nothing because there's nothing there to hear them? The thought terrified me, but once I let it in, I couldn't push it back out. I sat there in the holiest place in Islam, surrounded by millions of believers, and felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The panic was rising again. That feeling of not being able to breathe, and that feeling of drowning. And then, without really meaning to, I prayed one last prayer. It wasn't in Arabic. It wasn't formal. I just thought it, or maybe whispered it, I don't remember. God, if you're real, if you're actually there, I need you to show me. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending. Please. Just show me you're real. I fell asleep right there on the marble floor, using my arm as a pillow. I was so tired, I didn't care about how uncomfortable it was. I just wanted to disappear for a while. And that's when everything changed. I need to tell you about the dream, but I'm not sure I have the words for it. I've had dreams my whole life. Normal dreams, weird dreams, stress dreams, where I'm back in school taking an exam I didn't study for. I have had dreams that felt meaningful and dreams I forgot the moment I woke up. This was different from all of them. I was still in the Haram, the Grand Mosque in Mecca, but it was somehow different. Empty, or at least much less crowded. The lights were dimmer, softer. The Kaaba was still there in the center, but I wasn't focused on it. I was focused on the person walking toward me. He was dressed in white, but not like the ihram we pilgrims wore. This was different. The white seemed to glow, but not in a way that hurt to look at. And his face. I could see his face clearly, but I couldn't tell you now exactly what he looked like. That sounds impossible, I know, but in the dream, I knew him. I recognized him even though I'd never seen him before. He walked straight toward me, and he said my name. Not Omar, which is what everyone calls me, but my full name. The name my parents gave me, the name I barely use. He said it clearly, like he'd known me forever. I felt myself stand up, even though I didn't decide to stand. My heart was pounding. In dreams, usually things feel hazy, uncertain. This didn't. Everything felt hyper-real, more real than being awake. He stood in front of me, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, but it filled everything. He said, "I am the way. I have been with you your whole life." That was it, those words. But the way he said them, the weight of them, it was like every question I'd ever had was being answered at once. It was like being seen completely, every secret thing, and being loved anyway. Not judged, not condemned, just loved. I wanted to say something, to ask who he was, but I couldn't speak. I could only stand there as this overwhelming feeling washed over me. It wasn't just peace, it was more than that. It was like coming home after being lost for years. It was like taking the first real breath after drowning. It was relief so profound I wanted to weep. He looked at me with these eyes that were kind and sad at the same time, and he said something else, but I can't remember the exact words. I remember the meaning, though. He was telling me that he'd been there all along, through everything, waiting. That he knew me completely and had never left. Then he reached out and touched my shoulder. The moment he touched me, I felt this surge of something I can't describe. Love, but stronger than any love I'd known. Peace that made no sense. And underneath it all, truth. Absolute certainty that this was real, more real than anything else. And then I woke up. I opened my eyes, and I was back on the marble floor of the haram. There were people around me, pilgrims walking past, the sound of prayer echoing through the mosque. The Kaaba was there, and the lights, and everything was normal. But I was shaking. My whole body was shaking. There were tears on my face. My heart was racing so fast I thought something was wrong with it. I touched my shoulder where he'd touched me in the dream, and I could still feel it, this warmth, this presence. I sat up quickly, looking around like I'd see him there in the crowd. But there was just the normal flow of pilgrims, thousands of people going about their rituals. Nobody was paying any attention to me. What just happened? What was that? I tried to stand, but my legs were weak. I leaned against one of the marble columns and tried to catch my breath. The dream was already starting to fade the way dreams do, but those words stayed crystal clear. I am the way. I have been with you your whole life. The way. That phrase, I am the way. Why did that sound familiar? I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and typed the words into Google. I am the way. The results came up immediately. Bible verses, Christian websites, all pointing to the same passage, John 14:6. My hands went cold. I clicked on one of the links and read the verse. Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. No, 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 no. I closed the browser and put my phone away quickly, looking around like someone might have seen what I was searching. My heart was pounding for a different reason now. This was wrong. This was very wrong. In Islam, we believe in Isa, in Jesus, but as a prophet only, a great prophet born of a virgin who performed miracles, but not divine, not God, and absolutely not the only way to Allah. That's shirk, the unforgivable sin of associating partners with God. That's the one thing you cannot do. And I just had a dream where someone claiming to be Jesus told me he was the way, in the middle of Hajj, in Mecca, the holiest place in Islam. I tried to rationalize it. I was exhausted. I'd been under enormous stress. I'd probably heard that phrase somewhere before, maybe from one of my Christian friends in London, and my subconscious had dredged it up. Dreams are just your brain processing things. This meant nothing. But even as I thought these explanations, I knew they weren't true. That dream hadn't felt like my brain processing stress. It had felt like someone speaking directly to me. I pushed myself off the column and made my way out of the haram. My group was staying in a hotel about 15 minutes walk away. I needed to get back, to sleep in an actual bed, to wake up and have this all make sense. But I couldn't shake the feeling, the warmth on my shoulder, the absolute certainty I'd felt in that moment, the way he'd said my name. The next day, we completed more of the Hajj rituals. We did tawaf again, the farewell circling of the Kaaba. We prayed in the mosque. We took pictures. Everyone in my group was talking about how blessed they felt, how this had changed their lives, how they felt so close to Allah. I said the right things. I smiled for the pictures. But inside, I was somewhere else completely. I kept thinking about that dream. I'd try to focus on the prayers, on the meaning of what we were doing, but my mind would drift back to those words, I am the way. And worse, the feeling I'd had, that sense of being completely known and completely loved. I'd never felt that in a mosque, never felt it during prayer, not once in my entire life. But I'd felt it in a dream about Jesus. It made no sense. It went against everything I'd been taught. It was dangerous even to think about. We finished Hajj and traveled back to Jeddah. I was supposed to feel renewed, transformed, full of faith and devotion. Instead, I felt like I was carrying a secret that could destroy me. On the flight back to London, I barely slept. I kept replaying the dream, examining every detail. The way the light had looked, the sound of his voice, the impossible combination of authority and gentleness, that touch on my shoulder. I am the way. I have been with you your whole life. If it was Jesus saying that, what did he mean? With me my whole life? I'd been a Muslim my whole life. I'd prayed to Allah, fasted for Ramadan, I memorized Quran. How could Jesus have been with me through all that? Unless everything I'd been taught was wrong. The thought hit me like ice water. I looked around the plane cabin, afraid I'd said it out loud. But the other passengers were asleep or watching movies or reading. Nobody was paying attention to me and my crisis. What if Islam wasn't true? What if Jesus was actually who Christians said he was? Not just a prophet, but God himself, the way to the Father. No, I couldn't think like that. That was Shaitan, Satan, whispering doubts. That was exactly what I'd been warned about my whole life. The devil attacks when you're weak, when you're confused, and he makes falsehood look attractive. But the dream hadn't felt like an attack. It had felt like rescue. I got back to my flat in London in the early morning. I was jet-lagged and exhausted and emotionally destroyed. I dropped my bags by the door and fell onto my bed, fully clothed. I slept for 12 hours and woke up disoriented. For a moment, I didn't remember where I was. Then it all came back. The Hajj, the dream, the words. I grabbed my phone. I had messages from my family asking how the journey was, telling me they were so proud, asking me to tell them all about it. I couldn't deal with those yet. Instead, I opened a private browser window and searched for the verse again. John 14:6. I read the whole chapter this time. Jesus was talking to his disciples on telling them he was going to prepare a place for them, that they knew the way to where he was going. One of them said they didn't know the way, and Jesus answered, I am the way, and the truth, and the life. I clicked on another link, then another. I found myself on Christian websites, reading explanations of what Jesus meant, reading about how Christians believe Jesus was God in human form, that he died for sins, that he was the only bridge between humanity and God. This was insane. I was in my London flat, fresh back from Hajj, reading Christian theology. If anyone found out, if anyone saw my search history, I cleared the browser history and put my phone down. My hands were shaking again. I couldn't do this. I couldn't go down this road. It was too dangerous, too crazy. I'd done Hajj. I was renewed in my faith. That dream was just exhaustion and stress. I needed to forget about it and move on with my life. I tried. For 3 days, I tried. I went to work and told my colleagues about Mecca, about the crowds, about the rituals. I called my parents and told them how meaningful it had been, how grateful I was for the opportunity. I prayed the 5 daily prayers for the first time in years, being careful about the times, doing the ritual washing properly. But every night I'd lie in bed and those words would come back. I am the way. On the 4th night back, I couldn't take it anymore. I got up at 2 a.m. and opened my laptop. I found a website where I could read the Bible online, and I started reading the Gospel of John. That's where the verse had come from, so I figured I'd at least read the context. I expected it to be boring, or confusing, or obviously false. But as I read, something strange happened. The words felt familiar. Not like I'd read them before, but like they were speaking to something I'd always known but never had words for. Jesus talking about being the light of the world, about living water, about the bread of life, about knowing his sheep and his sheep knowing him. I read until the sun came up. I read about Jesus healing people, arguing with religious leaders, telling stories. I read about him washing his disciples' feet, even though he was their teacher. I read about him on trial, being beaten, carrying a cross. And then I read about the crucifixion. In Islam, we're taught that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. Allah saved him and made it look like someone else died instead. The crucifixion was a trick, an illusion, but reading the account in John, it didn't sound like an illusion. It sounded real and horrible and devastating. I read about Jesus saying, "It is finished," about him dying, about his body being taken down and buried, and then about the tomb being empty 3 days later, about him appearing to his disciples alive again. I closed the laptop as light started coming through my window. I felt physically sick, but also more awake than I'd felt in years. What if this was true? What if Jesus actually died and came back to life? What if he really was who he claimed to be? I got up and paced my flat. I was terrified, not of hellfire, not of judgment, but of what I was starting to feel. Hope. A tiny, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, there was an answer to the emptiness I'd carried for so long. But hoping for this meant abandoning everything else. It meant my parents were wrong. It meant the Imam was wrong. It meant the Quran was wrong. It meant my entire identity, everything I'd built my life on, was wrong. I couldn't afford to be wrong about this. The stakes were too high, so I kept reading. Every night after work, I'd come home and read more of the Bible. I started with the other Gospels, reading the same stories from different perspectives. Then I read Acts about the early Christians, about how the faith spread. I was looking for contradictions, for obvious errors, for something that would let me dismiss it all. But I kept finding things that resonated instead. Jesus telling a religious leader he needed to be born again. Jesus saying the greatest commandments were to love God and love your neighbor. Jesus talking to a Samaritan woman at a well, breaking all the social rules. Jesus touching lepers, eating with tax collectors and sinners, defending a woman caught in adultery. This wasn't the Jesus I'd been taught about in Islam. That Jesus was a good prophet who performed miracles and told people to worship Allah alone. This Jesus was claiming to be Allah himself, claiming to forgive sins, claiming that knowing him was eternal life. Either he was telling the truth, or he was a lunatic or a liar. There wasn't really a middle ground. I started watching videos on YouTube, testimonies of other people who'd converted from Islam to Christianity. I'd watch them late at night with headphones on, just terrified someone would somehow know what I was doing. These people told stories like mine about growing up Muslim, about having doubts, about encountering Jesus in dreams or visions. A lot of them had dreams. Apparently, this was a thing. Muslims all over the world reporting dreams about Jesus, about him appearing to them and telling them he was real. I'd never heard about this before, but now I was finding hundreds of testimonies. Was I crazy? Were all these people crazy? Or was something real happening? I started praying again, but differently. I didn't know how Christians prayed exactly, so I just talked. Out loud sometimes, in my head other times. I'd say things like, Jesus, if you're real, I need to know for sure. I need more than a dream. I need something I can't explain away. Nothing dramatic happened. No voice from heaven, no vision, no miracle. But something was shifting inside me. The constant anxiety I'd lived with for years was easing. Not gone, but quieter. I'd catch myself feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the forced, striving peace of trying to be a good Muslim. Not the fake peace of telling myself everything was fine when it wasn't. Real peace. Deep peace. The kind that didn't make sense, given how confused and terrified I was. About 6 weeks after Hajj, I was sitting in my flat on a Thursday night. I'd been reading the Gospel of Matthew, and I got to a passage where Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." I stopped reading. That was me, weary and burdened. I'd been tired for so long, trying so hard to be good enough, to pray enough, to be the right kind of son and the right kind of Muslim and the right kind of person. And here was this invitation. Not to try harder, not to do more rituals, not to earn anything. Just to come, to rest. I closed the laptop and sat there in the silence of my flat. It was late, maybe midnight. London sounds filtered through the window, distant traffic, voices on the street. And then, without fully deciding to, I started talking, out loud, to Jesus, to the person from my dream. I said, I don't know how this works. I don't know if I'm doing this right. I don't even know if you're really there or if I'm losing my mind. But if you are real, if that dream was real, if you're actually who you said you are. I stopped trying to find the words. Tears were running down my face. I said, I'm so tired. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending. I need what you offered in that dream. I need to be known like that. I need that peace. I paused, my heart pounding. Then I said, I believe you're real. I believe you're the way. I don't understand it all, but I believe you. I'm yours. Whatever that means, whatever it costs, I'm yours. I sat there after those words, crying, waiting for something to happen. There was no light from heaven, no voice, no overwhelming feeling. But there was something, that same sense of presence I'd felt in the dream, quieter now, but definitely there. A sense of not being alone, of being heard, of being accepted. I cried for a long time that night. Not sad crying exactly. Relief, maybe. Or release. Like something I'd been holding tight for years had finally let go. When I finally went to bed, I slept better than I had in months. No nightmares, no panic, just deep, restful sleep. I I woke up the next morning and my first thought was, what have I done? The peace from the night before was still there, but so was fear. I'd just committed myself to Jesus. I'd just become, what? A Christian? An ex-Muslim? A traitor? I got up and went through my morning routine on autopilot. Shower, coffee, getting dressed for work. I looked at my prayer mat in the corner, unused now for days. I looked at the Quran on my shelf. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, an Arab man in London, and thought, who am I now? My phone buzzed. Message from my mother asking how I was, telling me she loved me, saying she'd been thinking about me since Hajj and felt so grateful to Allah for giving her such a devoted son. The guilt hit like a physical blow. I put the phone down without responding. At work that day, I couldn't concentrate. I kept thinking about what I'd done, turning it over in my mind. There was no taking it back now. Something had shifted last night. Something fundamental. I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. During my lunch break, I went for a walk along the Thames. I found a bench and sat there watching the water, people walking past, London going about its business, completely unconcerned with my crisis. I pulled out my phone and searched for churches near me. There were dozens. I had no idea how to choose one, what to look for, whether I was even ready for this. But I knew I couldn't do this alone. If I was really doing this, if I was really following Jesus now, I needed help. I needed people who understood. I needed to learn what this actually meant. I clicked on a church website at random, a place called St. Mary's in Whitechapel. They had a service on Sunday mornings. The website talked about being a welcoming community, about following Jesus together, about everyone being welcome regardless of background. I bookmarked it. Maybe I'd go, maybe I wouldn't. I didn't know. But for the first time since that dream in Mecca, I felt like I was moving towards something instead of just running away. The fear was still there. The guilt was still there. The confusion was definitely still there. But underneath it all, quiet but steady, was that peace. That sense of being known. That feeling from the dream when he touched my shoulder and everything had felt, for just a moment, absolutely right. I am the way. I have been with you your whole life. I still didn't fully understand what those words meant. I was just starting to find out. And I knew even then that finding out was going to cost me everything I'd ever known. But I was ready to pay it. I didn't go to church that first Sunday. I walked to St. Mary's, got within sight of the building, saw people going in, and kept walking. I wasn't ready. Instead, I went home and spent the whole day reading. I downloaded a Bible app on my phone, buried in a folder with a generic name so if anyone looked at my screen they wouldn't see it. I read Romans that day, Paul's letter to Christians in Rome. It was dense, theological, sometimes hard to follow. But certain parts jumped out at me. There was a section about how everyone has sinned and falls short of God's glory, about how we're justified by faith, not by works, about how while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That hit me hard. In Islam, everything depends on the scale. Your good deeds versus your bad deeds, and you hope good outweighs bad enough that Allah will show mercy. But here was this idea that no amount of good deeds could ever be enough, that we needed something else entirely. We needed someone else to bridge the gap. I thought about all those years of trying to pray enough, be good enough, earn Allah's favor, the constant fear that I wasn't doing enough. And here was this message saying I couldn't do enough, would never do enough. And that was actually okay, because Jesus had done it instead. It felt too good to be true, like a cheat code. But as I kept reading, I started to understand it differently. It wasn't a cheat code. It was grace, unearned favor, love that came first before anything we did to deserve it. I spent the next several weeks living in this strange double life. During the day, I was Omar the engineer, going to work, being professional, maintaining normality. A few times I met up with Muslim friends from the community, went to dinner, made excuses for why I hadn't been to the mosque in a while. I was busy with work, I was tired, I'd go next week. They believed me because why wouldn't they? But at night, I was someone else. Someone seeking, questioning, slowly dismantling everything I'd built my identity on. I read the entire New Testament over the course of a month. Then I started on the Old Testament, trying to understand the context, the history, how it all fit together. I watched theological lectures on YouTube, hiding it from everyone. I read articles about Christian doctrine, about the Trinity, about the nature of Christ, about salvation. The Trinity especially confused me. How could God be one but also three? It seemed like exactly the kind of shirk, the polytheism, that Islam warned against. But as I read more, I started to see it differently. Not as three gods, but as one God revealed in three persons: Father, Son, Holy Spirit, like one person who's simultaneously someone's father, someone's son, and someone's friend, but exponentially more complex. I didn't fully understand it. I'm still not sure I do. But I started to accept that maybe I didn't need to fully understand everything to believe it was true. About 6 weeks after that night, when I first prayed to Jesus, I finally went to church. It was a Sunday morning in early October. I'd barely slept the night before. I was terrified someone from the Muslim community would see me going into a church, but I'd picked St. Mary's partially because it was far enough from the areas where most Muslims in London lived. I dressed normally, jeans and a jacket, trying not to look out of place. I got there a few minutes late on purpose, so I wouldn't have to talk to anyone beforehand. I slipped in the back and took a seat in the last row. The church was smaller than I expected. Maybe 100 people there. The building was old, traditional, with wooden pews and stained glass windows. Very different from a mosque. There were families, old people, young people, a mix of ethnicities, though mostly white British. Nobody paid much attention to me. They were singing when I came in. Hymns projected on a screen at the front. People standing, some with their hands raised, some just standing still, singing about God's love and Jesus' sacrifice. The music was different from anything I'd heard before. Not the call to prayer, not Quranic recitation, something gentler, more personal. I didn't sing, I just stood there, trying to process everything. After the singing, a man I assumed was the pastor went to the front and started preaching. He talked about doubt, about how even faithful people struggle with believing sometimes. He told the story of Thomas, one of Jesus' disciples, who refused to believe Jesus had risen from the dead until he could see and touch the wounds. The pastor said doubt wasn't the opposite of faith. Fear of truth was. Doubt could actually lead you closer to God if you let it. If you were honest about it instead of pretending everything was fine. I felt like he was speaking directly to me, even though he had no idea I was there. After the service, people lingered, talking and drinking coffee. I tried to slip out, but the pastor caught me by the door. He was in his 50s maybe, with graying hair and a kind smile. He introduced himself. I mumbled my name and he asked if I was new. I nodded, not sure what else to say. He didn't push for details, just said I was welcome anytime, that there was a newcomer's lunch after next week's service if I was interested. I said maybe and got out of there as fast as I could without being rude. But I went back the next week, and the week after that. Each time I sat in the back. Each time I listened to the sermons, sang some of the songs, tried to understand what it meant to be part of this. After about a month of attending, I finally went to that newcomer's lunch. It was in a room behind the church, just a few people sitting around a table with sandwiches and tea. The pastor was there, and an older woman named Margaret, and a couple in their 30s, and me. They asked where I was from, what brought me to the church. I gave vague answers. Saudi originally, living in London for work, just exploring Christianity. They were polite, didn't pry. But after lunch, the pastor asked if he could talk to me privately. We went to his office, a small room lined with books. My heart was racing. Had I done something wrong? Did he know I was Muslim or used to be Muslim? He sat down and looked at me with those kind eyes and just said, "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share, but if you need someone to talk to, I'm here." Something in me broke. Maybe it was the gentleness. Maybe it was the weeks of carrying this secret alone. I don't know, but I started crying right there in his office, and the whole story came pouring out. I told him about growing up in Saudi Arabia, about the strict Muslim upbringing, about coming to London and feeling lost. I told him about the failed prayers, the emptiness, the decision to do Hajj. And then I told him about the dream. I'd never said it out loud before. I described the figure in white, the words he spoke, the overwhelming feeling of being known and loved. I told him about finding John 14:6, about the weeks of secret reading, about that night when I prayed to Jesus and felt like something fundamental had shifted. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he'd heard similar stories before, that this kind of encounter with Jesus was more common than I might think, especially among people from Muslim backgrounds. He said God reveals himself in different ways to different people, and that dreams were actually very biblical, that God spoke through dreams throughout Scripture. He asked if I'd made a commitment to follow Jesus. I said I thought so, that night in my flat, but I didn't know if I'd done it right. He smiled and said there was no ritual formula, no magic words. If I'd sincerely given my life to Jesus, believed he was who he said he was, that was enough. Then he asked the hard question, had I told my family? I shook my head. He nodded like he understood. He said that was my decision to make, that the timing would be different for everyone, but that living in hiding was incredibly difficult. He'd seen other converts from Islam try to maintain the double life, and it took a huge toll. I knew he was right. The stress of it was eating me alive. Every phone call with my parents felt like lying. Every time I avoided the mosque or made excuses, the guilt grew heavier. The pastor asked if I'd considered baptism. I'd read about it, about how it was a public declaration of faith, but the thought terrified me. Public meant visible. Visible meant the Muslim community would find out. Find out meant my family would find out. And then, I didn't know what would happen then. He didn't push. He just said to think about it, to pray about it, and that whenever I was ready, the church would be there. I started meeting with him weekly after that. He gave me books to read, answered my questions about theology, helped me understand what following Jesus actually looked like in practice. He also connected me with something I hadn't known existed, a small group of other ex-Muslim believers. There were 5 of them, meeting in someone's flat every 2 weeks. Iranians, a Pakistani guy, a woman from Egypt, and a man from Syria. All of them had left Islam for Christianity. All of them understood the cost in ways other Christians simply couldn't. The first time I met with them, I felt less alone than I had in months. They knew what it was like to face family rejection. They knew the fear of being discovered. They knew the grief of losing your community, your identity, everything you'd been raised to believe. The Iranian guy, Reza, had been disowned by his family completely. He hadn't spoken to them in 3 years. The Egyptian woman, Mariam, still had a relationship with her mother, but it was strained and painful. The Pakistani guy, Asif, was in a situation like mine, not officially out to his family yet, but they were starting to suspect. We'd sit together in that small flat, drinking tea, talking about our experiences. We'd pray together, which was still new and strange for me. Christian prayer was so different from Islamic prayer, informal, conversational, personal. We talked to God like He was in the room with us, which, according to Christian belief, He was. These meetings became a lifeline. For the first time since that dream in Mecca, I had people I could be completely honest with. I didn't have to pretend to be a good Muslim. I didn't have to explain my background to people who didn't understand. We all got it. But even with this support, I was struggling. The internal war hadn't ended. It had just changed shape. There were nights when I'd lie awake, terrified I'd made the wrong choice. What if Islam was true and I'd just committed the one unforgivable sin? What if on Judgment Day, Allah would send me to Jahannam for eternity because I'd worshipped Jesus as God? The fear was real and visceral. I'd been taught since childhood that hellfire was real, that it was eternal, that nothing was worse. And here I was, deliberately choosing the exact thing I'd been warned against my whole life. But then I'd remember the dream. I'd remember that feeling of being fully known and fully loved. I'd remember the peace that had come that night in my flat when I first prayed to Jesus. And I'd remember reading the Gospels, seeing Jesus heal the sick and welcome the outcasts and forgive the sinners and claim to be the way. The evidence was piling up on one side, even as my fear pulled me toward the other. I started reading the Quran again, but critically this time, asking questions I'd never dared to ask before. I compared what it said about Jesus to what the Gospels said. I looked at contradictions I'd been taught to ignore or explain away. I researched the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection, for the reliability of the New Testament documents. I wasn't trying to disprove Islam out of spite. I was genuinely trying to figure out the truth. If Islam was true, I needed to know. If Christianity was true, I needed to know. I couldn't base my eternal destiny on a feeling or a dream, no matter how powerful it had been. The more I studied, the more convinced I became that the Christian account was true. The historical evidence for Jesus' death and resurrection was stronger than I'd expected. The reliability of the New Testament manuscripts was better than most ancient documents historians trust without question. The transformation of the disciples from scared, scattered men into bold martyrs who died for their testimony made no sense unless something real had happened. And then there was the Quran itself. I found things I'd never noticed before, problems I'd been taught not to question. Historical inaccuracies, internal contradictions, verses that seemed to contradict what Muslims believed. The more I looked, the more questions I had. I felt like I was deconstructing my entire worldview, piece by piece, and finding it empty. But accepting Christianity meant accepting what it would cost. My family would be devastated. My community would reject me. I might lose my job if word got out. I could be in physical danger, depending on who found out and how radical they were. I'd watch videos of other ex-Muslims online, their testimonies, and many of them talked about being disowned, threatened, even attacked. Some had to go into hiding. Some had to move to different countries. Some had lost everything. Was I ready for that? Was following Jesus worth losing my family? I struggled with that question for months. I loved my parents. They'd raised me, sacrificed for me, believed in me. My mother's face would flash in my mind, her tears when she'd said goodbye at the airport when I first came to London. My father's pride when I graduated. My siblings who I'd grown up with, who knew me better than anyone. How could I hurt them like this? How could I choose a religion over my own family? But then I'd remember that Jesus had said something about this. I'd read it in Matthew. He'd said anyone who loved father or mother more than him wasn't worthy of him. He'd said following him might set family members against each other. He'd said taking up your cross meant being ready to lose everything. It was in the job description. Following Jesus wasn't a comfortable addition to an existing life. It was a complete reorientation, a death and resurrection. The old Omar had to die for something new to be born. That scared me more than I can express. Around Christmas time, 4 months after that dream in Mecca, I decided to get baptized. The pastor had been patient, never pushing. But I knew I couldn't hide forever. If I really believed Jesus was Lord, if I really trusted Him with my eternal soul, then I needed to declare it publicly, even if just to a small group. We did it on a Sunday evening, just a small ex-Muslim group and a few church leaders. We used a portable baptism pool set up in the church building. I wore shorts and a t-shirt, standing in the water that was warmer than I expected. The pastor asked me if I believed Jesus Christ was the Son of God, that He died for my sins and rose again, and that I was trusting in Him alone for salvation. I said yes, My voice shook, but I said yes. Then he baptized me in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I went under the water and came back up, water streaming down my face, and everyone was clapping and some were crying. I felt like I'd stepped off a cliff. There was no going back now. I'd made it official, even if only a handful of people knew. I was a Christian. I was a follower of Jesus. I was no longer Muslim. The weight of it was enormous. But there was also a strange lightness. I'd been living in the shadows for months, hiding, pretending, terrified. Now, at least to this small group of people, I was fully known. I didn't have to hide anymore, at least not here. After the baptism, we had a small celebration. Cake and tea and lots of hugs. Reza, the Iranian guy who'd been disowned by his family, pulled me aside and told me to be prepared for hardship. He said following Jesus was worth it. But it wasn't easy. He said there would be days when I'd question everything, when the cost would feel too high, when I'd wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake. But he also said that on the other side of that suffering was a relationship with God that nothing else could compare to. Real intimacy, real peace, real purpose, not earned through religious performance but given freely through grace. I went home that night and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. Same face, same body, but everything was different. I was baptized. I was a Christian. There was no pretending this was just a phase or a curiosity or a mistake. I'd crossed the Rubicon. Whatever came next, I couldn't go back to who I'd been before. My phone buzzed. Message from my mother, wishing me good night, telling me she loved me, asking when I'd visit home again. She still thought I was the devoted Muslim son who'd just completed Hajj. She had no idea that son no longer existed. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I put my phone down without responding. I wasn't ready to tell her, not yet. But I knew the day was coming when I wouldn't be able to hide anymore. And when that day came, everything would change. The months after my baptism were the hardest of my life. I thought making the decision would bring clarity. That once I'd committed fully to following Jesus, everything would fall into place. Instead, I found myself living in two worlds, more sharply divided than ever before. At work, I was Omar the engineer, competent, professional, friendly with colleagues. A few of them knew I'd done Hajj earlier that year. One Muslim colleague, Tariq, who would sometimes invite me to pray Jummah at the mosque near our office. I'd make excuses, meetings, deadlines, feeling unwell. He'd look at me with concern and say I should make time for prayer, no matter how busy I was. I'd nod and agree and feel sick to my stomach. On Fridays after work, I'd go to St. Mary's for evening service. I'd sit with a small ex-Muslim group afterward, and we'd talk about our week, our struggles, our questions. These were the only hours when I could breathe fully, when I didn't have to monitor every word, every action. But then I'd go home to my flat in Canary Wharf, and the walls would close in. I was living alone with my secret, and the weight of it was crushing. My family expected me to visit Riyadh for winter break. My mother had been planning it for weeks, messaging about all the food she'd cook, about family gatherings she'd arranged, about how the whole family needed time together. She said I'd changed since Hajj. If for 2 weeks straight, how would I pray for 2 weeks straight? How would I pray 5 times a day, go to the mosque, participate in religious discussions, all while knowing it was a lie? But I also couldn't refuse without raising serious questions. So I booked the ticket. December in Riyadh felt surreal. Landing at King Khalid Airport, seeing Arabic everywhere, hearing the call to prayer echo across the city. This had been home for the first 18 years of my life. Now it felt foreign. My family met me at the airport. My mother crying happy tears, my father embracing me, my siblings all talking at once. They looked the same. I was the one who'd changed, in ways they couldn't see. At home, everything was exactly as I remembered. The smell of cardamom and oud incense, the prayer mats laid out, the Quran on the shelf, family photos on the walls, including pictures of me as a child in a white thobe, looking serious and obedient. That night, when Maghrib prayer time came, my father expected me to join him at the mosque. I couldn't refuse. We walked there together in the cooling evening air, and I went through all the motions, the ritual washing, the standing in rows, the Arabic words I'd memorized as a child. But my heart wasn't in it. My heart was somewhere else entirely. After prayer, some of my father's friends came over to talk. They asked about London, about work, about life in the West. One of them asked if it was hard to stay a good Muslim in England. Everyone laughed, but there was real concern underneath. I told them I managed, that I'd found a good mosque community, that I prayed regularly. My father looked proud. The lie tasted like ash in my mouth. The 2 weeks in Riyadh were an extended performance. I woke up for Fajr prayer because my father expected it. I fasted on certain days because my mother suggested it. I attended family gatherings where everyone talked about religion, and I nodded along, smiling, pretending. But at night, alone in my childhood bedroom, I'd read the Bible on my phone. I had downloaded it under a different app name, disguised it to look like something else. I'd read the Psalms, particularly the Lament Psalms, where David cried out to God in pain and confusion. I felt every word. My younger sister Aliyah noticed something was off. She was 23, married recently to a man my father had approved of. She cornered me one afternoon when we were alone and asked if I was okay. She said I seemed different, quieter, like something was bothering me. I wanted to tell her. God, I wanted to tell someone in my family the truth. But I couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. So I said I was just stressed from work, that London was expensive and demanding. She seemed to accept this, but I could tell she wasn't fully convinced. The worst moment came 3 days before I was supposed to fly back to London. My father called a family meeting in the living room. Everyone sat down and he announced that he'd been talking to a family friend, a businessman with a daughter my age. A good Muslim woman, educated, from a respected family. My father wanted to arrange a meeting when I visited next, to see if we might be compatible for marriage. My mother looked thrilled. My siblings were smiling. Everyone was looking at me expectantly. I felt like the walls were closing in. Marriage meant permanent ties to Riyadh, to this community, to this life. It meant lying to a woman for the rest of our lives together. It meant children raised as Muslims, perpetuating the deception into another generation. I said I wasn't ready yet. I said I needed to focus on establishing my career first, that marriage could wait a few more years. My father frowned. He said I was 27, that this was the right age, that waiting too long would make finding a suitable wife harder. My mother said she'd been praying about this, that she felt Allah wanted me to settle down, to start a family. She said after my Hajj, she'd hoped I'd be ready to take this step. I didn't know what to say. I mumbled something about thinking about it, about discussing it later. The conversation moved on, but the tension remained. I could feel my father's disappointment. That night, lying in bed, I had a panic attack, full-blown, couldn't breathe, heart racing, feeling like I was dying. I grabbed my phone and texted the pastor at St. Mary's, even though it was the middle of the night in London. I said I couldn't do this, that the lying was too much, that I needed help. He responded surprisingly quickly. Must have been early morning for him. He said to breathe, to focus on Jesus, to remember that God was with me even in Riyadh, even in this impossible situation. He said I didn't have to figure everything out tonight. Just survive until I got back to London and we'd talk through options. His words helped. I managed to calm down eventually, though I barely slept. I got through the last few days by shutting down emotionally. I went through the motions, smiled when expected, participated in family activities like a robot. Finally, the day came to fly back to London. My mother cried at the airport again. My father told me to think seriously about the marriage arrangement. My siblings hugged me goodbye. As the plane took off and Riyadh disappeared below, I felt like I could breathe again. But the relief was temporary. I knew I couldn't keep doing this. Something had to give. Back in London, I met with the pastor and told him everything about the arranged marriage pressure, about the impossibility of maintaining the charade, about feeling like I was being torn in half. He listened carefully, then asked what I wanted to do. Did I want to tell my family now or wait longer? Was I prepared for the consequences either way? I didn't know. I went back and forth. Some days I'd think I should tell them immediately, rip the bandage off, face whatever came. Other days I'd think I should wait, give them more time, give myself more time to be sure. The small ex-Muslim group had mixed advice. Reza said I should tell them before they tried to arrange a marriage, that it wasn't fair to the potential bride or to me to let it get that far. Mariam said I should wait until I had a solid support system, until I was financially independent of any family help, until I was ready for complete rejection. Asif, the Pakistani guy whose family also didn't know, understood my paralysis. He'd been in limbo for 2 years, Christian in his heart, but still attending mosque to keep up appearances. He said the waiting was torture, but the alternative terrified him too much to act. I kept attending church, kept meeting with the group, kept growing in my understanding of Christianity. I joined a Bible study, started serving in the church's welcome team, even began leading worship occasionally since I could play guitar. These activities felt natural, right? Like this was who I was meant to be. But every phone call with my parents felt like betrayal. Every lie, every evasion, every time I avoided their questions about mosque attendance or prayer habits, the guilt grew heavier. In March, 7 months after my baptism, something happened that forced my hand. My cousin Yusuf, who lived in Manchester, had seen me. He had been in London for business and happened to pass by St. Mary's on a Sunday morning. He'd seen me going into the church with a Bible in my hand. I didn't know he'd seen me until my phone rang late one night. It was him. His voice was cold, hard. He asked me directly, "Are you Christian now? Did you leave Islam?" I froze. I could lie, make up an excuse. Say I was just visiting for a project, researching something, curious about other religions. But sitting there in my flat with the phone pressed to my ear, I realized I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep lying. So I didn't confirm it directly, but I didn't deny it either. I said my faith journey had taken me in unexpected directions, that I was still figuring things out, that it was complicated. The silence on the other end was deafening. Then he spoke and his voice was shaking with anger. He said I'd betrayed the family, betrayed Islam, betrayed everything. He said I was going to hell. He said our grandfather would be rolling in his grave. Then he told me he was going to tell my father. I begged him not to. I said I needed time to tell them myself, in my own way. He said time for what? Time to compound the betrayal? Time to lead more people astray? He hung up. I sat there in shock, my phone still in my hand. This was it. My family was about to find out, and not in the way I'd choose to tell them. They'd hear it from Yusuf, framed in the worst possible light, before I had a chance to explain anything. I called the pastor, even though it was late. I told him what had happened. He said I needed to call my father immediately before Yusuf did, and tell him the truth myself. He said it was better for them to hear it from me than from an angry cousin. I knew he was right, but I couldn't make my hands dial the number. I spent the whole night awake, praying, pacing, terrified. I wrote and deleted a dozen texts to my father. I rehearsed conversations in my head. I thought about getting on a plane to Riyadh to tell them in person, but that felt cowardly too, like I was ambushing them. Finally, as dawn broke over London, I called my father. He answered, groggy and confused. It was early morning in Riyadh too. He asked if everything was okay, if something was wrong. I said we needed to talk. My voice was shaking so badly I could barely get the words out. There was a long pause. Then he asked if this was about Yusuf. So he already knew. Yusuf had called him first. My father's voice changed. The warmth drained out of it completely. He asked me one question. Is it true? I closed my eyes. I thought about lying one more time, but I couldn't. Not anymore. I said yes. Not directly. So not with the words, I'm a Christian now, but I said enough. I said my understanding of faith had changed, that I'd been on a spiritual journey, that I couldn't live the life he expected me to live. The silence stretched out so long, I thought he'd hung up. Then I heard my mother's voice in the background, asking what was happening. My father must have put me on speaker. My mother started crying before my father even explained. Maybe she'd guessed from the conversation. Maybe she just knew. My father's voice when he spoke again was cold and formal, like I was a stranger. He said I had one chance to fix this. Come home immediately. Speak with the Imam. Return to Islam properly, or I would no longer be his son. I tried to explain. I tried to tell him about the dream, about the months of searching, about how I hadn't made this decision lightly, but he wouldn't listen. He said I'd been corrupted by the West, that he'd made a mistake sending me to London, that this was his failure as a father. My mother was sobbing in the background. I could hear my siblings asking what was happening. My father gave me 1 week to decide. Come home and renounce Christianity, or be cut off completely. Then he hung up. I sat there as the sun rose fully over London, my phone dead in my hand, and realized I'd just lost my family. The next few days were a blur. My phone exploded with messages from relatives. Some were angry, calling me a traitor and an apostate. Some were confused, asking if it was really true. A few, just a few, were concerned, asking if I was okay. My mother sent a voice message. I almost didn't listen to it, but I did. She was crying, begging me to come home, saying she didn't understand how this had happened. She said she'd failed me as a mother, that she should have seen the signs. She said, please come back to Islam. Don't throw away your afterlife for this world. That message broke me. I listened to it over and over, hearing her pain, her desperation. I'd done this to her. My decision had caused this agony. But I couldn't go back. Not because I was stubborn or rebellious, but because I genuinely believed Christianity was true. I believed Jesus was who he claimed to be. And as much as it was destroying my family, I couldn't unbelieve it. The pastor and the church community surrounded me. People I barely knew offered support, brought me meals, checked in on me daily. The ex-Muslim group understood in ways others couldn't. We'd sit together, sometimes in silence, sometimes crying, sometimes praying. Reza told me it would get easier eventually, but that the grief was real and needed to be honored. He said losing your family felt like death because in many ways it was. The relationship you had with them died, even if they were still physically alive. A week passed. I didn't go to Riyadh. I didn't renounce Jesus. The silence from my family became absolute. He said, as far as they were concerned, I was no longer welcome in their home, that I'd brought shame on the family name. He said, as far as they were concerned, I was dead. Then he hung up. That was 3 months ago. Since then, life has been strange. Freeing in some ways, devastating in others. I don't have to lie anymore. Don't have to maintain the exhausting double life. I can attend church openly, read my Bible without hiding, or pray to Jesus without fear of being discovered. But I've lost my family. My mother doesn't speak to me. My father has blocked my number. My siblings send occasional messages, brief and careful, asking how I am, but never engaging with the real issue. Most of my extended family has cut me off completely. I'm building a new life, slowly. The church has become a kind of family, though it's not the same. I've started dating a woman named Emily. Yes, same name as before, but a different person. A Christian woman who understands my background and the cost I've paid. We're taking it slowly, both of us aware of how complicated my situation is. Work continues. Most colleagues don't know about my conversion. I'm still competent, still professional. But I've lost some Muslim friends who found out and stopped returning my calls. The Pakistani guy from our group, Asif, told his family 2 weeks ago. His father reacted similarly to mine. Complete rejection. We meet for coffee sometimes. Two ex-Muslims navigating this new life, supporting each other through the grief and the freedom. I still have panic attacks sometimes. I still wake up at 3 a.m. wondering if I made the right choice. I still feel the loss of my family like a physical wound that won't heal. But I also have peace. Real peace. The kind I was searching for my whole life. I have prayers that feel like conversations with someone who's actually listening. I have a faith that's based on grace rather than performance, on relationship rather than rules. I've started volunteering with a ministry that supports ex-Muslims. We meet in secret locations, help people who are questioning Islam, provide resources and support for those who've converted. It's risky work. Some of the people we help have been threatened by their families. But it's important work, necessary work. Last week, I got a text from my younger sister, Aliyah. Just 3 words. I miss you. I sat there looking at those words for a long time. I miss her too. I miss all of them. But I don't know how to bridge this gap. They want me to come back to Islam, and I can't. I won't. So for now, we're in this limbo. I'm building a new life in London, following Jesus, trying to figure out what it means to honor my family while also being true to what I believe. Some days are better than others. There's no neat resolution to this story yet. Maybe there never will be. But I'm learning that following Jesus doesn't mean everything works out perfectly. Sometimes it means losing everything and having to trust that He's enough. So far, He has been. Just barely, some days. But He has been. It's been 8 months since my father told me I was dead to him. I'm sitting here in my flat in Canary Wharf, trying to figure out how to end this story when I'm still living in the middle of it. There's no triumphant conclusion. No moment when everything suddenly made sense and became easy. If you're hoping for that, I'm sorry to disappoint you. But there are things I've learned, things I need to tell you while they're still fresh, while the cost is still high and the choice is still hard. The grief hasn't gone away. That's the first thing. I thought maybe after a few months I'd adjust, that losing my family would hurt less over time. Some days it does. But then my mother's birthday comes, or Eid, or I see a father and son walking together on the street and the loss hits me all over again. Last month was Ramadan. This was the first time in my life I didn't fast. I went to work every day, ate lunch normally, and each time I took a bite of food during daylight hours, I felt the weight of how much had changed. I wasn't breaking the fast because I was weak or rebellious. I simply wasn't Muslim anymore. The rules that had governed my entire life no longer applied. That should have felt freeing. Instead, it felt disorienting. Like I'd been walking on a path my whole life, and suddenly the path disappeared, and I was standing on open ground with no map. The church community has helped. People at St. Mary's have been kind beyond anything I expected. Margaret, the older woman I met at that first newcomers' lunch, has basically adopted me. She invites me for Sunday dinners, makes sure I'm not spending every evening alone. She doesn't try to replace my mother, but she offers something maternal that I desperately needed. The pastor and I still meet weekly. We're working through a book about Christian formation, about how faith is less about having all the answers and more about following Jesus into the unknown. Some of the theology still confuses me. the Trinity, predestination, arguments about baptism and communion. But I'm learning that not every question needs to be answered immediately. What matters most is that I've encountered someone real. That dream in Mecca wasn't a hallucination or wishful thinking. Jesus spoke to me, and everything that's happened since has confirmed that it was real. The peace underneath the pain, the sense of being held even when everything else was falling apart, the way doors have opened when I needed them. He's been faithful. Emily, the woman I'm dating, has been patient with my mess. She's British, grew up in a Christian home, and sometimes I think she doesn't fully grasp how alien all of this is for me. Marriage, carefully, aware of how marriage, carefully, aware of how complicated it would be. Her parents would welcome me. Mine would never speak to her. Our children, if we have them, would grow up without my side of the family. That reality sits heavy between us, unnamed but always present. I told her she should consider carefully whether she wants this. A husband whose family has disowned him, who carries trauma from his past, who's still figuring out what it means to be a Christian. She said she'd been praying about it, and she felt peace. I hope she's right. The ex-Muslim group has shrunk and grown. Reza moved to Canada for work. We keep in touch through messages. Mariam's mother finally cut her off completely after years of strained contact. She was devastated for weeks. Asif is doing better than expected, building a new life. I even dating someone now. But we've had 3 new people join. A Somali woman whose family found out, and she had to flee her home with just the clothes on her back. A young man from Morocco who had a vision of Jesus while working construction in London. An older Egyptian man who'd been secretly Christian for 10 years before finally leaving Islam publicly. Each of their stories is painful and beautiful. Each of them paid a high cost to follow Jesus. And each of them says the same thing, I'd say. It's worth it. That sounds insane, probably. How can losing your family, your community, your identity be worth it? What could possibly compensate for that cost? I can only tell you what I've experienced. Before all this, I was successful on paper but empty inside. I had everything the world said should make me happy, but I was dying slowly, drowning in guilt and performance and fear. I was living a lie, pretending to be something I wasn't, and terrified that the real me was unacceptable. That dream in Mecca was the first time in my life I'd felt fully known and fully accepted at the same time. Not despite my failures, not after I cleaned myself up, but right there in the middle of my mess. Jesus looked at me, all of me, and said, I am the way. Like he'd been waiting for me to stop pretending and come to him as I really was. Everything since then has been learning to live in that reality. That I don't have to earn love through religious performance. That I don't have to be perfect to be accepted. That grace is real and it's free and it changes everything. I still pray, but differently now. I don't pray 5 times a day at set times in Arabic words I memorized as a child. I pray when I need to, in English mostly, sometimes in Arabic, sometimes just sitting in silence. I talk to God like He's actually listening, because I believe He is. I still read scripture, but I'm reading a book about someone who loves me rather than a book of laws I'm constantly failing to keep. The Bible has become this rich living thing that speaks to my actual life rather than an ancient text I'm supposed to respect from a distance and worship. God, I never understood worship before. In the mosque, we'd recite the same prayers in Arabic, bow and prostrate in perfect unison, everything formal and prescribed. Now I sing songs about Jesus' love, and sometimes I cry. And that's okay. Sometimes I lift my hands, sometimes I sit quietly, sometimes I'm angry or confused, and I tell God exactly that. And He doesn't strike me down for being honest. Last Sunday, we sang a hymn I'd heard before, but the words finally clicked. It is well with my soul. Written by a man who'd lost everything, who'd experienced tragedy after tragedy, and yet he wrote, "Whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." I'm not sure I can say that yet, not completely. My soul still hurts. I still grieve. But I'm learning what it means to have foundational peace even in the middle of pain. To be held by God even when everything else is falling apart. 3 weeks ago, I got an email from Aliyah, my sister. Not a text, an email, longer than any communication I'd had from my family in months. She said she'd been thinking about me constantly, that she didn't understand my choice, but she missed her brother. She said our mother cried herself to sleep some nights. She said our father wouldn't talk about me at all, wouldn't allow my name to be mentioned in the house. She said she'd been researching Christianity in secret, trying to understand what could be so compelling that I'd give up everything for it. She hadn't found answers yet, but she had questions. Real questions, not rhetorical ones meant to prove me wrong. She asked if we could talk sometime. Really talk, without judgment from either side. She said she wasn't promising anything, but she wanted to understand. I cried when I read that email. Not sad crying exactly. Hope, maybe. The first crack of hope that maybe, someday, the distance between us might shrink. Not disappear, probably never disappear completely, but shrink enough that we could be siblings again. I wrote back immediately, told her yes, absolutely, anytime she wanted to talk. We've video called twice since then. Brief conversations, careful ones, dancing around the big topics. But we're talking. That's something. My father still won't speak to me. My mother sent one message through Aliyah. She prays for me every day that Allah will guide me back. I wanted to tell her I don't need guiding back, that I've finally found what I was looking for, but I know she'd never understand that. Not now, maybe not ever. So I pray for them instead. That's another thing that's changed. I pray for my family now, not to Allah, but to Jesus, asking Him to reveal Himself to them the way He revealed Himself to me. I don't know if that prayer will be answered in my lifetime. Maybe it won't, but I pray it anyway. The cost is still high. Some days it feels unbearably high. I see photos on social media of family gatherings I'm not invited to. Weddings, celebrations, births of new cousins. Life going on without me. My younger brother graduated from university last month. I found out from Facebook. I wasn't there. At work, Tariq, the Muslim colleague who used to invite me to Jummah, has stopped talking to me. Someone told him I'd converted. He won't even make eye contact now. I lost 2 other friends from the Muslim community when they found out. The Arab social circle I'd been part of in London disappeared almost overnight. I faced discrimination I never expected. Not from British people, ironically, but from my own community. Someone wrote Murtad on my car, Arabic for apostate. I've gotten threatening messages online from Muslims who found out about my conversion. Nothing serious enough to go to the police about, but enough to make me more careful, more aware of my surroundings. Emily's parents met me last month. They were warm and welcoming, but I could see the concern in their eyes. They understand their daughter is choosing a complicated life if she chooses me. They never said it directly, but I know they're worried. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd never had that dream. If I just completed Hajj, come home, married a Muslim woman my parents approved of, raised Muslim children, lived as a good son and a good Muslim. It would have been easier in so many ways. But I also know I would have been empty, performing a faith I didn't really believe, living a lie, dying slowly inside while everyone thought I was fine. That's not really life. That's just existence. Jesus said he came to give life, and life abundantly. I'm only beginning to understand what that means. It doesn't mean ease or comfort or everything working out perfectly. It means being fully alive, fully yourself, fully known. It means relationship instead of religious performance. It means grace instead of constant striving. And yes, sometimes it means losing everything else. I think about that phrase from the dream constantly. I have been with you your whole life. All those years growing up in Riyadh, memorizing Quran, praying in Arabic to Allah, Jesus was there. Through my doubts and questions, through my failures and guilt, through London and university, and the empty years trying to be good enough, Jesus was there. He was waiting. Not to condemn me for being Muslim, not to punish me for my mistakes, but waiting for the moment when I'd finally stop performing and come to Him as I really was. Broken, confused, desperate, empty. And when I finally did, in that prayer in my flat 8 months ago, He didn't reject me or require me to clean myself up first. He just welcomed me, like I'd always been His and He'd been waiting for me to realize it. That's the truth that keeps me going when the cost feels too high. I'm known, fully, completely known. Every secret thought, every failure, every moment of doubt, and I'm still loved. Not because I'm good enough or religious enough or pure enough, and just because that's who Jesus is. I spoke at a gathering last week, a group that supports people questioning Islam. About 50 people there, mostly Muslims curious about Christianity, a few Christians wanting to understand Islam better to reach their Muslim friends. I told my story similar to what I've written here, about the dream, the search, the cost. Afterwards, a young Pakistani man came up to me, maybe 23 years old. He was shaking. He said he'd been having dreams too, dreams about a man in white who called him by name. He didn't know what to do, was terrified to even tell anyone. He thought he was going crazy. I told him he wasn't crazy. I told him Jesus often reveals himself through dreams, especially to Muslims. I told him the road ahead would be hard if he chose to follow Jesus, that I couldn't promise him it would be easy, but I could promise him it was worth it. He cried. We prayed together, right there in the back of the room. He gave his life to Jesus that night, knowing full well what it might cost him. I gave him my number, connected him with the ex-Muslim group, made sure he wouldn't have to walk this road alone. That's my life now. Working as an engineer to pay the bills, but really living to help others who are going through what I went through. To be the support I wish I'd had earlier in my journey. To tell people that Jesus is real, that he's pursuing them, that the cost is high, but he's worth it. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe someday my family will come around. Maybe they never will. Maybe I'll marry Emily and we'll build a life together. Maybe that won't work out and I'll have to start over again. Maybe I'll stay in London. Maybe I'll move somewhere else. Maybe I'll be safe. Maybe I'll face worse persecution than I have so far. I don't know any of that. What I know is this: I encountered Jesus, not a religion, not a theology, not a set of rules. A person, real, alive, I am present. He called me by name in Mecca, and he's been with me every day since. And for the first time in my entire life, I feel known. Really known, seen, understood, accepted, not performing, not pretending, not hiding. Just me with all my mess and questions and failures, loved completely. That's what I gave up everything for. Not a religion, but a relationship. Not a system, but a person. Not rules, but grace. Was it worth it? You might ask me that question again in 5 years. And my emotional answer might be different depending on what I've walked through. But the truthful answer, the deep down answer, will always be the same. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Because here's what I've learned. You can have the world's approval and lose your soul. You can have your family's blessing and miss the one thing you were made for. You can follow all the rules and still be empty inside. Or you can lose everything and gain the one thing that actually matters. You can be rejected by everyone else and be accepted by God. You can walk a hard road and find that Jesus walks it with you. I chose the second path. I didn't choose it lightly. I didn't choose it without counting the cost, but I chose it and I'd choose it again. Not because I'm brave or special or because I have stronger faith than anyone else, but because I met someone in a dream in Mecca who knew my name, who saw all of me, and who loved me anyway. And once you've experienced that, once you've tasted that kind of love, you can't go back to pretending it doesn't exist. My name is Omar. I'm 27 years old. I grew up Muslim in Saudi Arabia, and I'm now a follower of Jesus in London. My family has disowned me. My community has rejected me. I've lost almost everything that once defined who I was, but for the first time in my life, I know who I actually am. I'm known by God. I'm loved by Jesus. I'm held by grace. And that, despite everything, despite all the cost and pain and loss, is enough, more than enough. It's everything.